Marcus Webb had built Webb Dynamics from nothing, which was the phrase people used about him in interviews and profiles, and the one unauthorized biography that had come out 3 years ago. And it was technically true in the way that phrase is usually technically true, which is to say it was true if you did not count the engineering degree from a school his father had been able to afford, or the $12,000 his uncle had loaned him to incorporate the original company, or the particular kind of confidence that comes from having grown up in a household where failure was understood to be a temporary condition rather than a permanent verdict. Marcus knew this about himself. He was 61 years old and had spent enough time in honest reflection, mostly in his 50s, to understand that the story he told about himself in interviews was simpler than the actual story, and that the actual story involved a great deal of help he had received and had not always acknowledged at the time he received it. This was, in part, why he did what he did on the second Tuesday of March. Webb Dynamics employed 11,000 people across 14 facilities, the largest of which was the headquarters campus outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, a sprawling complex of glass and steel that housed engineering, executive offices, and the showroom where Webb Dynamics displayed the industrial automation systems that had made Marcus a billionaire several times over. Marcus came to the Raleigh campus 3 days a week. He had an office on the top floor with a view of the research park and a staff of people whose entire job was to manage his time, which they did with the practiced efficiency of people who understood that a billionaire's time was the most expensive resource in the building. Marcus had been thinking, for about a year, about a specific kind of blindness that came with running a company of this size. He could read reports. He could review metrics on employee satisfaction and turnover and engagement, all the numbers that modern companies generated about themselves in an attempt to understand what was actually happening inside them. But he had come to suspect that the numbers were missing something, that there was a layer of reality at Webb Dynamics that did not show up in any report because the people who generated the reports were the same people the reports were measuring, and that this created a kind of structural blindness that no amount of additional data could fix. He had read, somewhere in his 50s, about a tradition in certain cultures and certain religious texts of disguising oneself to test the character of others, the stranger at the gate who turns out to be something more than a stranger, the test that reveals whether kindness is real or merely performed for the people who can reward it. He had thought at the time that this was an interesting story structure and nothing more. But the idea had stayed with him in the particular way that ideas sometimes do, returning at odd moments, accumulating weight over years until it became something he could no longer dismiss as merely interesting. He told no one what he intended to do except his wife, Renata, and his longtime assistant, Patrice, both of whom he needed for logistical reasons and both of whom he trusted in ways he trusted almost no one else in his professional life. Renata thought it was a reasonable thing to want to know. Patrice thought it was a terrible idea that could expose the company to liability and Marcus to ridicule if it ever became public, and she said so directly, which was one of the reasons Marcus had kept her as his assistant for 19 years. He listened to her concerns. He decided to do it anyway. The preparation took 6 weeks. Marcus worked with a costume designer recommended by a friend in the film industry, a woman named Ileana, who had done makeup and prosthetics for several major productions, and who signed a strict confidentiality agreement before she would even discuss the project. She built him a different face, not dramatically different, not the kind of disguise that would only work in poor lighting, but a careful and convincing alteration, a prosthetic that added age and wear to his features, contact lenses that changed his eye color, a wig and beard that were individually placed rather than glued on as a single piece. The kind of work that held up under close inspection, because it had been done by someone who understood that close inspection was exactly what it needed to survive. She taught him how to move differently, how a man who had spent years outside carried his weight differently than a man who had spent years in conference rooms, how the specific exhaustion of homelessness showed up in the shoulders and the hands and the way a person held eye contact or did not. He spent 2 weeks before the disguise was finished, actually living rough, not at Webb Dynamics, not anywhere near Raleigh, but in a different city entirely, under a different invented identity, sleeping in a shelter for 9 of the 14 nights and on the street for the other 5, eating at the places where people who had nothing ate, learning in his body what he had only known in the abstract before. He did this because Renata had told him when he first described the plan that if he was going to do this, he needed to actually understand what he was asking his disguise to represent. That showing up in costume without having sat with the reality underneath the costume would make the whole exercise a kind of theft, taking the appearance of suffering without taking on any of its weight. He had listened to her. He had done the 2 weeks. It had changed him more than he had expected, in ways he was still processing months later. The specific quality of being looked through by people who did not see you as a person requiring acknowledgement. The particular cold of nights, when you did not know if you would find a safe place before the temperature dropped further. The exhausting vigilance required simply to stay safe, which used up energy he had never had to account for in his entire adult life. He returned to Raleigh in April with the disguise complete and a story prepared. His name was Walter Combs. He had worked in maintenance for 30 years before a workplace injury, and a cascade of medical debt had taken his home and his savings, and eventually his sense of himself. He had been on the street for 8 months. He had heard there might be day labor or odd jobs available around the industrial parks on the edge of the city. The story was constructed from real elements, real patterns he had learned during his 2 weeks of actual homelessness. Real details that would hold up under the kind of casual questioning a person might encounter. He arrived at the edge of the Webb Dynamics campus on a Tuesday morning in April, dressed in layered and weathered clothing that Ileana had aged with the same care she had applied to his face, carrying a backpack that contained the few items a person in his invented circumstance might actually carry. He did not go in through the main entrance. He positioned himself near the loading dock and the employee parking structure, the places where workers entered and exited throughout the day, the places where a man without obvious purpose might plausibly be found asking if anyone had work or spare change or knew where he might find either. What followed was 11 days. Marcus had structured the test, if test was even the right word for something this unstructured, around simple presence rather than elaborate scenarios. He did not approach people with scripted requests. He simply existed near the edges of his own company's daily life and observed what people did when they encountered him. A fact of human geography they had not chosen and had not been trained to handle. An unhoused man near the loading dock who might be there for any number of reasons and who required some kind of response, even if the response was simply to walk past. Most people walked past. This was the first thing Marcus learned, and it was not in itself a surprise. He had expected this. The vast majority of his 11,000 employees, encountering an unfamiliar man near the loading dock, did what most people in most cities do when they encounter an unfamiliar person who appears to be in difficult circumstances. They adjusted their path slightly, avoided extended eye contact, and continued to wherever they were going. This was not, Marcus told himself in the moments after each such encounter, necessarily evidence of bad character. People walked past unhoused individuals dozens of times a week in any city, and the accumulated weight of those encounters created a kind of necessary numbness that allowed people to function, to get to work, to manage their own lives without being paralyzed by every difficult thing they passed on the way. He tried to hold this understanding even as the accumulated experience of being walked past, day after day, did something to him that he had not fully anticipated. A slow erosion of something he had not realized was load-bearing until it began to give way. But some people did not walk past, and Marcus paid close attention to who they were and what they did, because this was the actual purpose of the exercise. On the 3rd day, a young woman named Felicia Drummond, who worked in the warehouse logistics division, and whom Marcus did not know personally despite having approved. 2 years earlier, a budget request that had funded the very logistics system she now operated stopped near the loading dock on her way to her car at the end of her shift. She did not have much. Marcus could see this in the way she dressed, the model of her car when she eventually got into it, the careful economy of someone managing a modest salary in an expensive housing market. She asked if he had eaten. He said not since the day before. She did not have cash on her, she said, But she had a protein bar and an apple in her bag from her own lunch, and she gave him both without ceremony, without making it a performance. The way you hand someone something you have simply decided they need more than you do. She asked his name. He told her Walter. She told him hers. She said she hoped things got better for him. She left. Marcus thought about Felicia Drummond for the rest of that day and several days after. He had approved her division's budget without ever learning her name, without any mechanism in his organization that would have connected the decision he made in a conference room to the actual person whose work made that decision matter. He thought about how many Felicias existed inside Webb Dynamics. People doing careful and decent things that never surfaced into any report he would ever read. And he understood with a specificity he had not had before what his earlier instinct about structural blindness had actually meant. On the fifth day, a man named Desmond Carrera, a facility supervisor whom Marcus did recognize, though Desmond did not recognize Marcus, stopped and did something different from anyone else. He did not simply give Walter something. He asked Walter directly what kind of work he had done before, and when Walter described 30 years in maintenance, Desmond's face changed in a specific way, the way a person's face changes when they recognize a category of competence they respect. Desmond said he could not promise anything but that Webb Dynamics sometimes used temporary contractors for grounds and basic facility work through a staffing agency, and he wrote the agency's name and a contact person on the back of a receipt and told Walter to mention his name, Desmond Carrera, when he called. He said it would not guarantee anything, but it would get the call answered. Then he reached into his wallet and gave Walter $40, which Marcus would later learn was close to half of what Desmond had on him that day, and said, "Get yourself something hot to eat, not a protein bar, something hot," and went back to his shift. Marcus did not call the staffing agency. He could not, without revealing himself or creating a paper trail that would have complicated the experiment beyond what he intended. But he noted the name, and he noted what Desmond had done, the specificity of it, the practical usefulness layered over the immediate generosity, and he filed it away with the growing list of things he intended to act on once the 11 days were finished. There were others. A security guard named Otis Pell who let Walter sit just inside the loading dock overhang during a hard rain on the 7th day, technically against policy, and brought him a cup of coffee from the break room without comment. A young engineer named Priya Anand who, encountering Walter on her lunch break, sat down on the curb next to him and ate her own lunch in his company, not performing charity but simply sharing space with him, asking him questions about his life that suggested genuine curiosity rather than a transaction she needed to complete before she could feel good about herself. By the end of the 11 days, Marcus had a list of 14 people who had, in some specific and meaningful way, treated Walter Combs as a person deserving of basic acknowledgement and care, out of the hundreds who had walked past. And then there was Gregory Pruitt. Gregory was a vice president in the executive division, one level below Marcus's direct reports, a man Marcus had hired 4 years earlier and had, in that time, come to regard as one of the steadier and more reliable people in the building, a man whose quarterly numbers were consistently strong and whose presentations were polished in the particular way that made boards comfortable and shareholders satisfied. Gregory drove a car that cost more than most of his colleagues made in a year, and he did not hide this fact. Did not perform humility about his success the way some executives did, which Marcus had previously read as a kind of honesty he respected, a man comfortable enough with himself not to need to disguise what he had. On the 9th day, Gregory Pruitt encountered Walter Combs near the executive parking structure, which Walter had drifted toward in the late afternoon, partly because Marcus wanted to see how the people in the upper tiers of his own organization behaved, the people whose success he had been most directly responsible for cultivating. What happened took less than 90 seconds, and Marcus would replay it in his mind many times in the months that followed. Gregory was walking toward his car, talking on his phone, a casual call about dinner reservations, the specific cadence of someone who had never had to think hard about whether he could afford a restaurant. He noticed Walter sitting near the structure's entrance. He did not stop talking on the phone. He did not make eye contact. He reached into his pocket, not breaking stride, not pausing his conversation, and threw a handful of change in Walter's general direction. The way you might toss something to a dog you wanted to move along without actually engaging with, and said, still mostly to the person on the phone but loud enough for Walter to hear, "Get a job," before continuing toward his car without breaking his conversation about dinner reservations even once. Marcus sat with the coins scattered around him for a long moment after Gregory's car pulled away. It was not the failure to give that affected him, though the contrast with Felicia and Desmond and Otis and Priya was obvious enough. It was the specific quality of contempt in it, the casualness of it, the way Gregory had not even paused his phone call to perform the small act, had treated an actual human being as an obstacle to be cleared from his path with minimum expenditure of attention, had said get a job in a tone that assumed everything about Walter's circumstances and dismissed all of it in 3 words. Marcus picked up the coins. There was $1.40. He sat with that number for a long time, the specific smallness of it, the arithmetic of contempt. He ended the experiment 2 days later on the 11th day, not because anything new had happened, but because he had what he needed and because Renata had begun to express real concern about how the experience was affecting him, the way he had grown quieter in the evenings, the way he sometimes did not respond when she spoke to him, lost in something she could see but not fully access. He went home that evening, removed Walter Combs in stages over several hours with Ileana's help, and sat in his own bathroom mirror afterward, looking at his actual face for a long time, before he felt entirely returned to himself. He did not act immediately. This was important to him, a discipline he imposed on himself deliberately. He would not make decisions in the raw emotional aftermath of the experience, however justified those decisions might feel in the moment. He waited 3 weeks. He thought carefully about what he had actually learned and what he wanted to do with it, separating the parts of the experience that were about specific individuals from the parts that were about the structure of his company, the parts that called for personal consequence from the parts that called for systemic change. What he built, eventually, were several things at once, he established. With Patrice's careful help in designing the actual mechanics of it, a substantial fund, anonymous in its sourcing as far as the broader employee population was concerned, that would recognize and reward exactly the kind of unrecorded decency he had witnessed during his 11 days. A fund that managers could nominate employees for when they observed quiet, uncelebrated acts of character. Not performance metrics, not sales numbers, but the kind of thing Felicia Drummond had done without ceremony and without expecting anyone to ever know. He named it, after some consideration, the Webb Dynamics Quiet Service Award, and he made sure the first round of recipients, decided through a process that did not pass through his own office and therefore could not be traced back to his personal knowledge of the 11 days, included Felicia Drummond, Desmond Carrera, Otis Pell, and Priya Anand, each of whom received a substantial monetary award and a framed citation and, more importantly to Marcus, a public acknowledgement within the company of the specific quality of character they had demonstrated, even though none of them would ever know the actual circumstances under which that character had been observed. Felicia Drummond, when she received her award at the quarterly all-hands meeting, was specifically baffled because as far as she knew she had not done anything noteworthy, had simply given a homeless man a protein bar and an apple on her way to her car one Tuesday in April, an act so small in her own accounting of her life that she had nearly forgotten it by the time the award was announced. When she stood up to accept it, she said into the microphone, with the visible discomfort of someone who did not feel she had earned this kind of attention, that she did not understand what specifically she was being recognized for, that she had just done what anyone would do. Marcus, sitting in the audience in his own face, his own suit, his own identity, watched her say this and thought about how completely wrong she was, how most people, in his own observed experience, had not done what she did, and how the gap between what she believed was ordinary and what was actually rare was precisely the gap his entire experiment had been designed to find and illuminate. The matter of Gregory Pruitt took longer and was handled with more deliberation. Marcus did not fire him immediately, and in fact did not fire him at all in the way a more impulsive executive might have. walking Gregory into an office and ending his employment over a single observed incident, however revealing that incident had been. Marcus understood with the same discipline that had made him wait 3 weeks before acting on any of it, that a single 90-second window, however clear in what it revealed, was not necessarily the whole truth of a person, and that justice, if that was even the right word for what he was trying to administer, required more care than a single data point could support, however compelling that data point felt. Instead, Marcus had a series of conversations over the following months conducted by Patrice and by the head of human resources, conversations Gregory did not know were connected to anything specific. Conversations framed as routine leadership development discussions that happened to probe, with increasing specificity, at how Gregory thought about the people below him in the organization, how he talked about employees in lower-wage positions, how he treated the contractors and service staff who maintained the building he worked in every day. What emerged across these conversations and the careful observation that accompanied them was not a single bad moment, but a pattern, a consistent and unmistakable thread of contempt for anyone Gregory perceived as beneath him, a thread that had simply never surfaced in any of the metrics that had made him look on paper like one of the company's strongest performers. Marcus terminated Gregory's employment 5 months later, not for the 90 seconds at the parking structure, which was never mentioned in any official conversation, but for the documented pattern that the 90 seconds had pointed him toward investigating. Gregory received a standard severance package and no public explanation beyond restructuring, and he left believing his departure was simply one of corporate life's ordinary unfairnesses, never understanding that a homeless man he had thrown coins at in April was the reason it had happened at all. Marcus thought about this asymmetry often in the months afterward. Gregory would never know what had actually happened to him, would never connect his termination to that 90 seconds at the parking structure, would likely tell some version of his own story at his next job that did not include throwing change at a person he had refused to look at. And Felicia Drummond would never know that the protein bar and the apple she had given without thinking had been witnessed by the company's founder in disguise, would simply believe, for the rest of her career at Webb Dynamics, that she had received a strange and somewhat embarrassing public recognition for an ordinary kindness she barely remembered performing. Neither of them would ever know the full truth of what had happened, and Marcus had decided, after careful consideration, that this was correct, that revealing the truth would change the nature of what he had witnessed, would turn observed character into performed character, would corrupt the very thing he had been trying to protect by recognizing it. He kept Walter Combs's face in a box in his home office closet. Not to use it again, but because he did not want to discard something that marked a genuine before and after in his own understanding of himself. He had gone in believing he was testing his employees. He came out understanding he had also been testing something in himself. Whether he could be treated as nothing and survive it with his sense of his own worth intact, a question his entire adult life had insulated him from ever needing to ask. He thought often about Desmond Carrera's $40, about Otis Pell's coffee against policy, about Priya Anand sitting down on a curb to share her lunch with a stranger who asked for nothing, and about the particular arithmetic of $1.40 thrown without a pause in a phone call. He understood that the company he had built, the 11,000 people, the 14 facilities, the reports and metrics that flowed up to his office every quarter, contained within it both of these things simultaneously, the quiet, uncelebrated decency and the casual contempt, existing side by side in people who looked, on paper, equally successful, equally valuable, equally deserving of the company's investment in their continued advancement. The numbers had never been able to tell him which was which. Only the 11 days had told him that, before you go, I want to leave you with something to carry. Marcus Webb did not learn what he learned from a report or a survey or any system designed to measure character. He learned it by becoming, for 11 days, someone the world was prepared to ignore, and by paying close attention to who chose not to ignore him anyway. Most of us will never run an experiment like this, but all of us encounter nearly every day some version of Walter Combs, someone the world has made easy to walk past. The character we show in those small, unwitnessed moments. The protein bar, the $40, the cup of coffee against policy, or the coins thrown without pausing the phone call is not separate from who we actually are. It may in fact be the truest measure of it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been the person walking past or the person who stopped? Be honest with yourself. I want to hear it. And if this story made you think about the people you walk past in your own life, carry that with you today. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.